Every murder tells two stories. One is written in evidence, crime scenes, timelines, and verdicts. The other lives in the mind, where obsession takes root, where resentment grows, and where one moment changes everything. This is Murder Mindset, a true crime podcast that goes beyond what happened to uncover why it happened. I'm Kelsey Coffey, and in this episode, we step inside the psychology, the relationships, and the warning signs that led to a deadly outcome. Because understanding the mindset is the first step toward understanding the crime. Before we begin today's episode, a content warning. What you're about to hear is an account of a mass homicide involving intimate family relationships, severe financial conflict, coercive control dynamics, and the murder of two young children. This case contains graphic descriptions of violence and loss that may be triggering for some listeners. Listener discretion is strongly advised. With that said, let's step back to December 24th, 2007. A day that should have been filled with love, anticipation, and the simple joy of being together. But in a small rural community east of Seattle, Christmas Eve would become the day that everything changed forever. It's 5:13 in the afternoon. A 911 dispatcher picks up a call from a home in Carnation, Washington. For exactly 10 seconds, the operator hears screaming, chaos, voices in distress. There's noise, commotion, the unmistakable sound of terror. And then the line goes dead. The dispatcher tries calling back. Once, twice, nothing. The silence that follows those 10 seconds will haunt this community for years to come. Officers arrive at the scene at around 5:45 p.m. But what they find inside will test the limits of their training and their humanity. 3 generations of one family, executed methodically, deliberately, in their own home. Children, parents, grandparents. 6 people, all dead. But here's what makes this case so profoundly disturbing. The killers weren't strangers hiding in the shadows. They weren't intruders who broke down the door. They were family. They lived just 200 yards away, on the same property, in a small trailer nestled on the land they didn't own. And one of the perpetrators, a woman who'd grown up in this community, known to neighbors as quiet, troubled, perhaps paranoid. Her name was Michelle Anderson. And the man standing beside her, the man who would take the lives of at least 4 members of this family directly, was her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe. I'm Kelsey Coffey, and this is Murder Mindset. Today, we are taking you inside the Carnation Christmas Eve Murders, a case that reveals how resentment festers into madness, how financial desperation can warp a family beyond recognition, and how one person's twisted narrative can become another person's justification for unthinkable violence. We're going to walk through the escalation that led to this moment, examine the psychological manipulation that bound these 2 perpetrators together, and ask the hard question that haunts every family that loses someone to intimate violence. How did we not see this coming? What red flags were missed? And what can the rest of us learn from this tragedy so that we might recognize the signs before it's too late? Wayne Anderson was 60 years old when he died on Christmas Eve 2007. He was a Boeing engineer. But to the people who knew him best, Wayne was so much more than just his job title. He was a father who wanted to provide for his family, to give them opportunities to build a stable life in the quiet town of Carnation, Washington, a small rural community about 25 miles east of Seattle, nestled among mature trees and sprawling properties that promised privacy and peace. Wayne was married to Judy, a woman who worked as a postal worker, someone whose job meant she knew the community. She had relationships with her neighbors. She understood the rhythms of small-town life. She was someone who showed up and was present. Together, Wayne and Judy had built a life. They owned a home on a tree-lined property. They had raised children. And on Christmas Eve, They were preparing for exactly what Christmas should bring: family gathering, traditions, the presence of people they loved under one roof. Wayne and Judy had 2 children together, Scott and Michelle. Scott was 32 years old, married to a woman named Erica, who was also 32. Scott and Erica had 2 children, Olivia, who was 5 years old, and Nathan, who had just turned 3. These were the people who were supposed to be arriving at Wayne and Judy's house on Christmas Eve 2007. 3 generations coming together in a home that belonged to the oldest generation. A place where memories lived, where family traditions were honored, where the cycle of life and love was supposed to continue. Judy was wrapping presents that afternoon, the kind of simple, tender task that defines the hours before a family holiday. She had her gifts arranged, her wrapping paper and ribbons close at hand. She was creating the experience of Christmas. Not just material gifts, but the love embedded in the act of preparation. Wayne was in the home. Scott and Erica and Olivia and Nathan were on their way. It was the kind of day that should have unfolded with the quiet satisfaction of a family reunited, of rituals observed, of love affirmed. But there was another person on the property. Michelle Anderson lived in a mobile home on her parents' land with her boyfriend Joseph McEnroe. Michelle was the younger of Wayne and Judy's 2 children, 30 years old, and according to what would emerge in police interviews and court records, she was in the grip of a different emotion entirely. This was not a woman at peace preparing for Christmas. This was a woman festering with resentment. This was a woman who believed she had been wronged by her brother, by her parents, by the unfairness of life as she experienced it. Michelle was unemployed. She was living in a trailer on her parents' property, rent-free, as a family arrangement. But according to what she would later tell police, she felt disrespected. She felt that her brother owed her money, $40,000. She claimed money that had been lent over the years and never repaid. She believed her parents sided with Scott, and that they had taken his side against her. And now, she said, her parents were asking her and Joseph to start paying rent on the trailer. To Michelle, this was the final indignity. This was proof that her own family did not value her, did not support her, did not recognize her as worthy of their unconditional love. What family and friends would not know until much later, until after the tragedy had unfolded, was that Michelle had spent weeks, approximately 2 weeks, according to her own confession to police, thinking about what she would do to solve this problem. She was not having a bad day. She was not in a moment of rage that might have been triggered by a single event. She was planning. She was imagining. She was walking through scenarios in her mind, rehearsing the moment when she would finally be free of the people she believed had oppressed her. In the days leading up to December 24th, she had acquired weapons. A 9mm semi-automatic pistol. She had brought Joseph into this fantasy, convinced him, or so his defense would later claim, that her family was the enemy, that they were dangerous, that the only solution was to eliminate them. Joseph had a revolver, a .357 caliber Magnum. Judy was wrapping presents. Wayne was in the home. Scott and Erica were traveling to spend Christmas with the family they loved. Olivia and Nathan, just 5 and 3, were excited to see their grandparents, to celebrate, to be part of the ritual of family. And Michelle was in her trailer, loaded with weapons, her mind set on a course that would, within hours, erase 3 generations from existence. She was about to transform Christmas Eve from a day of joy into a day of unspeakable horror. She was about to prove that family, the institution we trust above all others, can harbor secrets so deep and so dark that we cannot imagine them until they explode into violence. Wayne Anderson was a man who had built things. Judy Anderson was a woman who connected with her community. Scott Anderson was a brother and a father. Erica was a wife and mother. And Olivia and Nathan were children, pure and innocent, who had done nothing wrong except be born into a family where one person had decided they needed to die. The relationship between Michelle and her family had not always been fractured. Families rarely start their descent into violence overnight. Instead, it's a slow erosion, a series of moments where disappointment accumulates, where perceived slights harden into grudges, where the story someone tells themselves about their victimhood grows louder and more convincing with each passing day. Michelle and Scott had once been close. That fact matters. That fact makes what happens next even more chilling. Scott married Erica, and to Michelle, this marriage seemed to change the dynamic. Scott was no longer available to her in the same way. He was building his own family, his own life, his own priorities. And Michelle, according to what she would later describe to police, felt abandoned. She felt betrayed. She felt that Scott cared more about his wife and children than he did about his sister. Then there was the question of money. Michelle claimed that Scott had borrowed $40,000 from her over the years. This was a significant sum, particularly for someone who was unemployed, someone who was living in a trailer on her parents' property, who didn't have a stable income of her own. According to Michelle's narrative, and this is crucial, Scott had refused to pay the money back. He had broken a promise. He had taken advantage of her generosity, and when Michelle asked for the money, when she pressed the issue, she felt that her parents sided with Scott. They didn't pressure him, they didn't demand that he pay his sister back. Instead, from Michelle's perspective, they protected him. They took his side. They made it clear that their loyalty lay with their son and his wife and their grandchildren, not with their troubled, unemployed daughter who lived in a trailer on their land, rent-free. The relationship between Michelle and her parents had its own complex history. Wayne and Judy were asking Joseph and Michelle to start paying rent on the trailer. This was a reasonable request from the parents who owned the property, who had already been providing their adult daughter with free housing, utilities, and presumably food and support. But Michelle didn't experience this request as reasonable. She experienced it as rejection, as a sign that her parents no longer wanted her there, as proof that they did not value her, as confirmation of what she had perhaps always suspected, that she was a burden, that she was not truly wanted, that the family would be better off without her. This is the dangerous territory of escalating resentment, where a parent's reasonable boundary becomes, in a child's mind, an act of cruelty, where a sibling's marriage becomes betrayal, where the normal friction of family relationships becomes evidence of a conspiracy against you. Joseph McEnroe had arrived in this toxic environment as an outsider. He came from Arizona to be with Michelle. By all accounts, he was a Target employee, a working man, someone employed, someone who had moved across the country to be in a relationship with someone he had met online or through some other means. But according to what McEnroe himself would later describe in his recorded police interview and during trial testimony, he experienced Michelle's narrative about her family as absolute truth. He believed that Wayne and Judy were abusive. He believed that Scott was a thief who had stolen from his sister. He believed that the family was dangerous, toxic, and that Michelle needed protection. This is textbook coercive manipulation. One person creates a narrative, convinces another person that this narrative is true, and then gradually escalates their mutual isolation until the outside world seems like the enemy, and any action taken against the enemy seems justified. Michelle had effectively turned Joseph into what she called, in a moment of brutal honesty, an attack dog. The two of them lived in the trailer together, separated from the main house by about 200 yards, And according to neighbors' reports that would emerge later in the investigation, they were becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. Michelle was described as paranoid. There were reports of black material covering the windows of the trailer, blocking the outside world, ensuring privacy, creating a bunker mentality. They were us against the world in their minds. The family on the hill, in the main house, had become an obstacle to their happiness. And Michelle, who had spent 2 weeks planning what would happen on Christmas Eve, had convinced Joseph that this obstacle needed to be removed. Not all of it. Not at first. The original plan, according to what Michelle would tell police, was to kill her parents and steal money. They would make it look like a robbery. They would disappear to Canada. They would escape with enough cash to start over. But then Scott and Erica and their children arrived. And the plan, in Michelle's mind, had to expand. She could not leave witnesses. She could not leave survivors who might identify them, who might testify against them, who might carry the trauma of what they've seen. So the children had to die too. The decision to murder her own niece and nephew, 5-year-old Olivia and 3-year-old Nathan, was made quickly, in the moments after Scott's family arrived at the house. It was not in a fit of rage, but in cold calculation. Michelle did not want these children to grow up traumatized by what they had witnessed, or so she would later claim. More likely, she simply could not afford to leave evidence. We know the exact time the violence began because of what happened next. The crime itself unfolded with terrible precision. Michelle and Joseph left the trailer where they lived and walked approximately 200 yards across the property, to the main house where Wayne and Judy Anderson lived. It was late in the afternoon, around 4:30, 4:45, the time when daylight was beginning to fade. When the light takes that particular quality of late December, weak, angled, golden at the edges before it surrenders to darkness. They were armed. They entered the house. There was no need to break down the door. They lived on the property. They had access. They had every right to be there. And neither Wayne nor Judy had any reason to expect what was coming. McEnroe distracted Judy Anderson. She was wrapping Christmas gifts, that tender task we mentioned earlier. And McEnroe engaged her in conversation, in distraction, in the kind of ordinary human interaction that would keep her attention away from what Michelle was about to do. Michelle confronted her father. She raised the 9mm pistol. She fired. But the weapon malfunctioned. In that moment, when her own gun failed, when her plan faltered, Joseph McEnroe stepped in. He shot Wayne Anderson in the head. Judy heard the sound, and she ran towards the room where her husband had just been shot. And Joseph McEnroe fired twice, killing her as well. 2 people dead within minutes. The oldest generation erased. Now came the work that neither of them expected would be so physically or psychologically demanding. Michelle and Joseph dragged the bodies of Wayne and Judy Anderson outside the house and into a small shed in the backyard. Back in the house, they began the grotesque work of cleaning up the blood, of making the scene look as innocent as possible, of preparing for the next phase of their plan. They waited for Scott, Erica, and their 2 children to arrive. This is an almost incomprehensible moment to contemplate. Sitting in the house where you have just murdered 2 people, knowing that more family members are on their way, knowing what you're about to do to them, waiting with patient deliberation for them to walk through the door. When Scott arrived with his wife and children, the situation escalated into something far more chaotic. According to police reconstruction and the confessions of both Michelle and Joseph, Scott may have sensed something was wrong, or perhaps he didn't. Perhaps the scenario unfolded differently than they had anticipated. At some point, Scott attempted to grab Michelle's weapon. There was a struggle. Michelle fired the revolver 4 times at her brother. Joseph McEnroe then also fired at Scott. Erica, seeing her world collapsing in real time, tried to escape. She was wounded, not killed. And in an act of survival and maternal desperation, Erica managed to reach a phone. At 5:13 in the afternoon, exactly 2 hours and 28 minutes after the timeline we've been reconstructing and still on Christmas Eve, Erica made a 911 call. For exactly 10 seconds, the dispatcher heard screaming, chaos, the sound of a woman in mortal crisis. There were noises in the background, voices, violence, the infrastructure of a murder happening in real time. But Erica could not speak directly to the operator. She could not explain what was happening. She could only make that call. Joseph McEnroe, realizing the police were on their way, he grabbed the cordless phone from Erica's hands, and then, with cold finality, he shot Erica Anderson. Later, investigators would find 5-year-old Olivia huddled beneath her mother's body. The child had apparently tried to hide, to protect herself, to find safety where none existed, as well as 3-year-old Nathan. Both children were killed per Michelle's explicit instructions because she did not want them to grow up traumatized by what they had witnessed. Police officers responding to that 10-second 911 call arrived at approximately 5:45 in the evening. The killers, knowing that they needed to create a narrative that would protect them, or at least delay their arrest, locked the gate at the entrance of the property. Michelle drove back to the trailer where they lived. They waited. They prepared a story. They thought about what they would say if questioned. And when officers arrived, when the scene was discovered, when the full horror of what had happened began to unfold, they were still there, on the property, waiting to be interviewed. When officers arrived at Wayne and Judy Anderson's property on that evening of December 24, 2007, and then continued their investigation into the morning of December 26th, they faced a scene that was immediately confusing in its brutality. Multiple victims, multiple caliber weapons, victims scattered across different rooms and locations, parents dead in the shed, children dead inside the house. The family that had been gathering for Christmas had instead become a crime scene that would yield one of the most straightforward and most damning cases in recent Washington state history. But the breakthrough did not come from forensic science, though forensics would certainly corroborate the narrative that emerged. The breakthrough came from the confessions. Both Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe were brought in for questioning. They were interviewed separately by detectives. And here is where the case takes a remarkable turn. Both suspects, faced with the reality of the crime scene, faced with the weight of the evidence, and perhaps faced with their own consciences, began to tell the truth. Joseph McEnroe provided a recorded interview describing his role in the murders. He acknowledged that he had fired the fatal shots into Wayne, Judy, Erica, Olivia, and Nathan. He claimed, and this is important for understanding his defense strategy in the trial that would follow, that he had been coerced, that Michelle had pressured him, that he was mentally unstable and easily manipulated. But he did not deny the facts. He did not claim he wasn't there. He confessed. Michelle Anderson, for her part, initially tried to maintain a cover story. For approximately 45 minutes of her 2-hour recorded interrogation with detectives, she told investigators that she and Joseph had left the property to go to Las Vegas to elope. She claimed they had come back twice, once to get her wallet, and then once to get fruit off the counter. But detectives were patient. They laid out the evidence. They asked her direct questions. They allowed the weight of the truth to accumulate. And then, somewhere in the middle of that interrogation, Michelle broke. She said, "It's not Joe's fault. It's all me." She admitted to shooting her father, though her weapon malfunctioned, admitted that McEnroe had to finish the job. She admitted to shooting her brother Scott and her sister-in-law Erica multiple times. She admitted that she had told Joseph to shoot the children. "I just thought if they saw their parents dead, that they would be scarred for life," she told detectives. And then, in what may be the most chilling moment of the entire interrogation, she said, "As soon as I shot the gun, I felt so bad, like, what the hell have I done? I'm a monster. I've turned into a monster." When detectives asked her how long she had planned these murders, she told them exactly what they needed to hear. She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks, planning it, organizing it, gathering weapons, converting her boyfriend into a co-conspirator, constructing a narrative about her family that justified their deaths in her mind. The evidence at the scene corroborated every detail of her confession. The weapons matched, the number of shots matched, the positions of the bodies matched. The forensic evidence, the ballistics, the autopsy results from the medical examiner all pointed to a coordinated, premeditated attack carried out by 2 people who knew exactly what they were doing. The medical examiner's office determined that all 6 victims had been shot in the head at close range. This was not a crime of passion that had spiraled out of control. This was systematic execution. This was a plan executed with precision. Phone records and digital forensics would reveal the text messages and calls between Michelle and Joseph in the days leading up to the crime. Evidence that prosecutors would later present to show premeditation and planning. Financial records would show Michelle's specific allegations about the money that her brother owed her. Witness statements would confirm that neighbors had noticed Michelle and Joseph had been increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid, and that neighbors had expressed concern about Michelle's mental state. But here is the stunning reality. None of this forensic work, none of these investigative breakthroughs were even necessary. Michelle and Joseph confessed completely. The evidence was overwhelming. Joseph McEnroe and Michelle Anderson were both charged with 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The prosecutor's office made the decision to seek the death penalty for both defendants. This was not a minor decision. In the state of Washington, capital cases require a rigorous legal process, and pursuing the death penalty means accepting that this case will take significantly longer. But given the nature of the crime, 6 victims, including 2 very young children, all killed systematically in cold blood, the prosecutor believed the death penalty was justified. McEnroe's trial began in the fall of 2014 and extended for nearly 4 months. The prosecution's theory was straightforward and supported by overwhelming evidence. Joseph McEnroe, working in concert with Michelle Anderson, traveled to the Anderson family home on Christmas Eve 2007 with 2 loaded firearms and the explicit intention of committing murder. He murdered Wayne Anderson, murdered Judy Anderson, murdered Erica Anderson, murdered Olivia Anderson, a 5-year-old child. He murdered Nathan Anderson, a 3-year-old child. He did all of this not in a momentary fit of rage, not in self-defense, not under duress so extreme that a reasonable person would not have any other choice but to comply. He did this because he had been convinced by Michelle Anderson that her family was the enemy. He did it to eliminate witnesses and to facilitate their planned escape. The prosecution presented McEnroe's own confession, recorded by detectives. The prosecutor laid out the timeline methodically. He presented forensic evidence showing that every victim had been shot in the head at close range. He presented photographs of the crime scene and the bodies. He argued that McEnroe had, by his own actions, killed most of the people in that home. But the defense strategy was different. McEnroe's defense team argued that their client was not a cold-blooded killer, but rather a vulnerable, mentally ill man who had been manipulated and coerced by Michelle Anderson. They presented evidence of McEnroe's troubled childhood, a mother who was mentally unstable, an upbringing marked by instability and neglect, a man who had grown up without secure attachment or healthy relationships. They argued that McEnroe suffered from mental health issues that made him susceptible to Michelle's manipulation. They presented testimony suggesting that McEnroe had been transformed by Michelle into an attack dog, a tool she used to accomplish her own desires. They argued essentially that while McEnroe fired the shots, Michelle was the true architect of the murders, and that McEnroe was a tragic figure who had been used by a person far more psychologically sophisticated than himself. In a desperate bid to avoid the death penalty, McEnroe's defense even offered to have him plead guilty if the prosecution would remove capital punishment from the table. The prosecution refused. The trial proceeded through the winter of 2014 into the spring of 2015. The jury found McEnroe guilty on all 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The verdict was delivered in March 2015, but the case was not over. Because McEnroe had been convicted of capital crimes, the jury had to participate in what was called a penalty phase, a separate legal proceeding where the jury would hear arguments about whether McEnroe should deserve the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. During this penalty phase, which lasted approximately 5 weeks, the jury heard McEnroe's attorney argue for mercy based on mental health, childhood trauma, and the influence of Michelle Anderson. The jury heard prosecutors argue that McEnroe had murdered 6 people, including 2 very young children, and that this crime deserved the ultimate punishment. The jury deliberated for approximately 3.5 days, and then they voted. 8 jurors believed McEnroe deserved the death penalty, but 4 did not. In Washington state, the death sentence must be unanimous. Because the jury was not unanimous, McEnroe was sentenced to 6 life sentences, 1 for each victim. Michelle Anderson's trial began in late January 2016 and proceeded over 5 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation. Because the jury had voted against capital punishment for McEnroe, prosecutors made the decision not to seek the death penalty for Michelle Anderson. She would face life in prison without parole if convicted. The prosecution's theory was that Michelle Anderson was the mastermind behind the entire conspiracy. She had harbored resentment. She had planned the murders for 2 weeks. She had acquired weapons. She had recruited her boyfriend to assist. She had explicitly told Joseph McEnroe to shoot her own niece and nephew. She rationalized the murders of innocent children as necessary to prevent them from being traumatized. She had done all of this not in a moment of crisis or temporary insanity, but with deliberation, with premeditation, and with clear intention. The prosecutor showed the jury photographs of each victim's bodies. He held up the photos one at a time and asked the jury to look at them, to see the reality of what Michelle Anderson had done. He said that Michelle Anderson felt slighted by her family, felt disrespected, had decided that the solution was to eliminate them. Michelle Anderson's defense team argued a very different narrative. They did not present an opening statement, which meant they were essentially conceding the facts of the case and hoping to convince jurors that there was reasonable doubt about premeditation, or that Michelle Anderson's mental state at the time of the murders meant she was not fully responsible for her actions. They argued that she was deeply depressed, deeply unstable, and that she had experienced a mental health crisis rather than engaging in a calculated plan. They emphasized that Michelle herself had initially said that she should be executed for her crimes, a statement that they argued showed she was not thinking clearly about her own culpability. But the jury did not find this defense convincing. After 5 weeks of trial and just 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Michelle Anderson guilty of 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The verdict was delivered on March 3, 2016. At her sentencing hearing on April 20th, 2016, victim impact statements were presented by the family of the deceased. Pam Mantle, mother of Erica Anderson, stood before the court and told Michelle Anderson directly, "You are a bully and a coward." The judge sentenced Michelle Anderson to 6 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The legal case that had begun with confessions in the days after the murders had concluded with convictions, lengthy sentences, and the certainty that both Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe would spend the rest of their natural lives in prison. What happens after the gavel comes down? What happens when the verdict is read and the sentences are announced and the perpetrators are led away to prison? The families whom remain, the families who have lost not just one person, but multiple people, who have lost 3 generations, who have lost the foundation of their existence, face the long, grinding work of learning to live with a void that will never be filled. Pam Mantle, who spoke so powerfully at Michelle's sentencing, had lost her daughter Erica and her 2 grandchildren, Olivia and Nathan. She had to navigate a world where 3 people she loved were simply gone, where Christmas would never again be a day of family gathering, but instead a day forever marked by her family being destroyed. The extended Anderson family has had to find ways to honor the memory of Wayne and Judy, their parents or grandparents, to grieve the loss of Scott and Erica, and to process the profound trauma of knowing that someone in their own family, someone who shared their blood, someone who had been raised alongside them, was capable of such violence. What you've heard today is more than a crime story. It's a reminder of how quickly emotion can turn fatal and how often the warning signs go unseen. If you or someone you know is experiencing violence, coercion, or emotional abuse, help is available, and reaching out can save lives. To support the podcast, visit patreon.com/murdermindset. I'm Kelsey Coffey, and until next time, lock your doors, bolt your windows, and beware the dangers hiding in plain sight.